Welcome so much to the first of our TOTE Puerto Rico customer town halls, where we've brought to you today two again of our probably most requested panelists. Luis Bacco, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's been happening over the past 6 to 8 weeks with the change in administration and some other areas of impact to the Puerto Rican economy, as well as some things to look forward to. So lots of positive news there. And then we're going to talk a little bit more with Lillian. About 6 or 7 months ago, Lillian came to us, talked a lot about the food insecurities on the island and a lot of hopes that they had with the change of administration. So a lot of great things happening there that we are excited to share with you guys as a group. First, before we turn it over to them, I do want to take a shout out to those of us in our country who are dealing with some significant weather challenges. Our hearts and prayers are with you that the worst is over and a quick recovery out to those areas as well. We are recording this session, so if there are folks within your teams that are not able to join us, please reach out to your sales rep. Within the next 24 hours or so, we can have a recording of the session that you guys can share with them. So first, I am going to turn it over to Luis. I do have a question for you, Luis. Hopefully, something that most of our customers have asked us as well is a lot has happened since the start of the year in both the administrations as well as with the COVID vaccine within Puerto Rico. Can you share with us just a few of the updates that truly are impacting the Puerto Rico economy at this time?
Hi to everyone. It's nice to be back. I'm actually back in DC. I just spent 2 months in Puerto Rico, staying away from the bad weather here in the States. But it's actually quite nice in DC. It's sunny. It's about 62 degrees, so not complaining here. I know that wasn't the case a week and a half ago, but nevertheless, I share Heather's thoughts on those of you that have been impacted by the bad weather recently, and hope you all are doing well. And again, happy to be here, just sharing some thoughts on where I see things as I usually do. And I think this is now my 4th time in this forum. I'll start off with a little bit of background of what's going on in Puerto Rico since our last session, I think was in December. Because a lot has happened actually since then, and then move quickly over to DC, and then provide an outlook, because obviously the two of them are intertwined, and whatever happens in DC impacts Puerto Rico. So I'll provide some background on where I see things headed here, and then just provide a quick outlook and open up for questions. And Heather, I will address your question as we move along on the presentation. But if you will recall, the last time we met back in December, I started by saying that it's a well-known thing that elections have consequences, and I believe that the past 2 months or so have proven this to be very true, not only in Puerto Rico but also here in the U.S. mainland. Going to Puerto Rico, as you know, we currently have what we call a divided government. And while this is not new to us, we've had divided governments before, where we've had a local, we've had a governor from one party and a legislature controlled, or one or both chambers of the legislature controlled by the opposition party. What makes things now a bit different is that we've had representatives and senators elected from 4 different parties into our legislature. So even though you have Pedro Pierluisi from the New Progressive Party as governor, and then you have a PDP, which is the pro-Commonwealth Party controlled legislature by very small margins. But you have representatives from the Independence Party in both chambers. You have representatives from 2 emerging parties in both chambers, and we even have an independent senator. So this has brought about something that is new to us, which is the need to govern by making coalitions, making alliances. This may be something that parliamentary systems in Europe and elsewhere are used to, but that is not the case with us. So now, if the PDP wants to pass anything in the legislature, they're going to have to reach out and get votes from some of these emerging party candidates, and that is true also for the NPP. So this is uncharted waters for us, certainly unprecedented. And I think, as we discussed back in December, it's a sign of people just being honestly fed up with the major political parties and looking for other alternatives. So that obviously presents some challenges, but also presents opportunities. And we'll go into that a little bit later. Now, it's been said that a new administration coming in has like a 100-day kind of like honeymoon period to implement its top priorities. I think in the case of Puerto Rico, that appears to be over, and we're only a month and a half into the new Pierluisi administration. And I say so because we're starting to see signs in the media. I mean, just last week, Pierluisi went over to the legislature to meet with both the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, and they were looking for ways to show a united front in an issue that is really critical for Puerto Rico, which is this need to come up with some kind of like federal tax incentive proposal to bring manufacturing that would incentivize manufacturing going back to Puerto Rico. And as you will recall from our last discussion, in the previous Congress, the 116th Congress, we had several competing proposals that were Puerto Rico specific. You had the proposal from the resident commissioner, from Jennifer Gonzalez, that was more along the lines of a distress zone kind of arrangement that would be applicable everywhere in the U.S., in every single jurisdiction, county, or whatever that met the threshold for to qualify as a distress zone. And then on the other hand, you had a very different approach in the Nidia Velazquez Stacy Plaskett bill that was basically implementing a limitation on the GILTI tax for businesses operating in U.S. territories, obviously including Puerto Rico. Now, so there was an effort underway by the governor and the opposition party to see if they come up with a united front so that everybody would be pushing for just one proposal rather than have competing proposals, and then have somebody else then come up and make a decision on our behalf because we can't get our act together. That effort, and now I go back to perhaps the ending of the honeymoon, appears to have been affected because of a recent controversy, and when I say recent, it's from the last 2-3 days, on status. As we had on the status issue, as we had talked about back in December, it was expected that, given the results of the plebiscite in Puerto Rico that also took place same time of the election, where statehood got close to 53% of the vote, that Pierluisi and the resident commissioner would lead a strong push for statehood, trying to, in a way, link it to the big effort that's also out there for DC statehood. And obviously that's very controversial back home. And the opposition party that controls the legislature obviously is a pro-Commonwealth party, so they oppose that effort, and we're starting to see a big rift between the two on the status issue. So that I think is going to impact. We can, on the other hand, I can tell you, we can anticipate there's going to be a very strong push for statehood coming up in the next couple of weeks, with potentially the introduction of an Admissions Act as soon as next week, and in both the House and Senate, and also a Nidia Velazquez competing proposal that would set forth a constitutional assembly to address the status issue. So status is very much on the table, triggered by the plebiscite of November. But given that you have the pro-Commonwealth party controlling the legislature, that sets up, an area of a lot of disagreement. Now, Pedro Pierluisi just last week filed his first package of legislative measures in the legislature. It took a bit longer than anticipated, and I think you can kind of like justify it because he doesn't control the legislature, and he wanted to make sure that his first package of bills, administration bills, would be something that would have broad support. One of them in particular, which is relevant to this discussion, is House Resolution 63, which proposes auditing the public debt of the island. That's something that's been discussed for years, and it's now become a policy of the administration, and it's something that should have broad support within the legislature. And as I said, we can anticipate now moving to DC a big push for statehood in the coming weeks. So stay tuned. Check the press next week, because I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on that. Now, moving now to the federal side. As you all know, it's been a turbulent beginning of the year in DC, to say the least. We started off with the President Trump's challenges to the election report, leading to the unfortunate events of January 6th, and then the recently concluded impeachment trial. While all of this is happening, we had when we last talked, we still didn't know what was going to happen in the Senate, because we still didn't know what was going to the outcome of the Georgia Senate runoff. Well, now obviously we know that the Democrats took both seats, and in doing so, they were able to secure a majority, even though it's 50-50, but with the deciding vote of the Vice President Harris, it becomes a majority. That wasn't unclear then. It is clear now. So we have a Democrat-controlled Senate and obviously a Democrat-controlled House. That gives, I think, the Biden administration a 2-year window to implement some of its top priorities, because obviously we're having midterms again in 2 years. And given, I think the expectation would be that the Democrats should retain the Senate and perhaps increase their majority there, but the House is very much at play. So there's a 2-year window, which is critical to Puerto Rico to getting a lot of this Biden administration initiatives implemented and enacted. But with everything that's going on, I have to say, and this is coming from a Republican here, that the Biden administration clearly has hit the ground running. In just the first 30 days, or even less than 30 days, he signed like 40 executive orders. That is unprecedented, more than any president in recent history. Recall that he was sworn in on January 20th, and by February 19th, less than a month from then, he had already passed 40 executive orders. Nearly half of them were reversing Trump administration policies, from immigration to COVID to whatever. I mean, at least half of the 40 were to reverse Trump administration policies, much of which had been implemented by executive orders as well. As I mentioned, we had the Georgia Senate runoff, which gave Democrats control of the Senate with a 50-50 margin. And then, of course, they still control the House, but it's also a very small margin, so there's really no room for error there, 220 to 213. Another sign, and this is very different from what we've seen in Puerto Rico, President Biden has already been able to have 9 of his 23 cabinet members confirmed by the Senate. Some will argue that those were the easy ones, the no-brainers, and now the more controversial ones are coming up. But nevertheless, he's already had 9 of 23 confirmed. Pierluisi hasn't had a single cabinet member confirmed in the Puerto Rico legislature. So they're all serving on acting capacity, but that gives you a lay of the land of how things are in Puerto Rico right now versus how they are here. And with that background, because I want to leave time for questions, I'll give you what I think is the outlook moving forward. As we all know, Puerto Rico's economy faces serious challenges post-COVID, particularly for the first half of this year. There are, as we discussed the last time, Puerto Rico's return to economic growth could be, even with all the, everything that's going on, could be substantially accelerated by several factors. One of them is the success, and this goes to your question, Heather, the success of the already ongoing COVID vaccination process. And just to give you an update on where Puerto Rico is right now, as of last week, Puerto Rico had administered more than 340,000 vaccines of the close to 600,000 that we've received from the federal government. 73% of those constitute the first dose, 27% of those are for the second dose. Now, of course, this effort has been slowed down quite a bit over the last couple of weeks because of the recent bad weather. And that is true for most states, I would assume, but due to the recent bad weather in the U.S., that has complicated getting vaccines down to Puerto Rico, and that has slowed down what started off as a very aggressive and rapid process. Now, another key item is the anticipated injection of already approved tens of billions of federal dollars. We went into this issue the last time as well, but now we're beginning to see movement. And we had anticipated then that a Biden administration would be more friendly, if you want to call it that, to Puerto Rico. And I think we're beginning to see that with the recent announcement of the release of more than $6 billion in CDBG funds that had already been allocated to Puerto Rico, but had been withheld, and Puerto Rico had not access to them. Those funds have been released now. That's part of the initial $20 billion CDBG allocation. So it's $6 billion that the Biden administration announced just a couple of weeks ago that they were releasing. And those of you that follow the Puerto Rico press, there was also in the news the last day or so, there's an FOMB led agreement with bondholders that would substantially that would save Puerto Rico billions of dollars in the debt servicing. That still needs to be approved by the court, but nevertheless, it's a positive sign. There's some aspects of it that remain controversial, particularly as it pertains to the pension plans. But nevertheless, I think it's good progress in the right direction, and that will also help Puerto Rico moving forward. Assuming that it's in fact approved by the court. So again, as we talked a bit about the Biden presidency, as you all will recall, and I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but as he was campaigning in Florida and trying to secure the Puerto Rican vote there and elsewhere in the states, as you'll recall, there's now close to 6 million Puerto Ricans residing in the U.S. mainland versus maybe 3.2 million on the island. So he adopted a very comprehensive Puerto Rico specific platform that, if implemented, would bring about unprecedented progress to the island. And again, I won't get into a lot of detail because it's a 7-8 page document. But his platform rests on 4 major pillars, which is support for a full recovery and infrastructure reconstruction to modern standards. That includes not only housing, it includes energy grid, it includes just bringing the island's infrastructure into the 21st century, really. Roads, bridges, whatever, you name it. Also investing in Puerto Rico's future through economic development initiatives and support for families. And I know Lillian will add, will go into a lot of detail on this, because that includes a full transition from NAP to SNAP. It includes equality in healthcare, particularly Medicare and Medicaid. Another item that is key to his platform is providing relief from unsustainable public debt, and then which may have somewhat been achieved with the recent announcement by the FOMB, but it's still an ongoing issue that only covers part of the debt. And then, of course, last but not least, expanding access to education and workforce development. And as I said, one of his key items was to make sure that all the money that had been allocated to Puerto Rico actually made it to the island. And we saw an advance of that with the $6 billion announcement just a couple of weeks ago. Now, another issue that's pending before Congress that would heavily impact Puerto Rico is the potential adoption of Biden's $1.9 trillion America Rescue Stimulus Plan, which, just like the CARES Act and the other stimulus bills that have been approved over the last year or so, would heavily impact Puerto Rico. The government of Puerto Rico, AFAF in particular, has estimated that the island would receive at least $5 billion under the current bill as it is drafted right now, and I think we're going to see changes to it. But the current proposal, as drafted right now, would see Puerto Rico receiving north of $5 billion. That's on top of all the CDBG, CARES Act, all of that funding, $10 billion FEMA funding for the energy grid, and the $3 billion for reconstruction of the education infrastructure. I mean, we're talking tens of billions of dollars. If this bill were to be enacted in its current form, it would represent north of $5 billion to Puerto Rico under the Biden proposal. Now, this bill is expected to be voted on the floor of the House on Friday and in the Senate sometime next week. The outcome still is unclear given the very small margin that Democrats have in the House and Senate, especially the Senate, where they can't afford to lose a single vote. And it appears that there's unanimous opposition from the Republican side to this bill because of the size. The Republicans are proposing something more along the lines of $700 billion. This bill is $1.9 trillion. So there's a big gap between the Republican and the Democrat proposal. But the outcome is still unclear because there are still issues with several key provisions, namely the minimum wage increase, which is also something that I know this group would be interested in. This proposal, as currently drafted, would increase the minimum wage to $15 by 2025. Whether that would be applicable to Puerto Rico or not, it's a matter of it's still unclear. This is my personal opinion, but I don't think that Puerto Rico can do a $15 minimum wage increase by 2025. But there's been precedent of Puerto Rico not being past extensions of minimum wage not being applicable to Puerto Rico. There are proposals in Puerto Rico that would incrementally bring the minimum wage up, but 15% would be a steep climb for the island, and it remains a controversial thing. Not that it doesn't have merit. I mean, I think nobody can argue against the $15 minimum wage for working families, but nevertheless, it's a controversial measure, and it's unlikely to make it as part of the final bill, but it's there. And then the other big issue that remains is the student loan forgiveness issue. Biden had proposed a $10,000 cap on maximum for student loan forgiveness. Progressives in the House particularly want to have a $50,000 cap, so that remains another controversial item on the bill. Quickly, just to wrap up, another thing that we should expect that will impact Puerto Rico is that Biden has also supported the reestablishment of the White House working group on Puerto Rico. That's clearly a positive development. The Trump administration for the last year appointed Admiral Brown, who actually I believe did an excellent job, but he came in too late. Prior to Admiral Brown, there was really no point person at the White House dealing with Puerto Rico issues. That will not be the case anymore. There's going to be a new Puerto Rico working group operating out of the White House with representatives of every single federal agency that is relevant to Puerto Rico. So that is a welcome development. And then lastly, and last point is manufacturing. And talked about it a little bit when we talked about the different proposals pending before Congress, whatever. I think this is perhaps the most significant economic development opportunity for Puerto Rico right now. While it remains, the Biden administration hasn't really come up with a proposal just yet that is Puerto Rico specific. Biden does have his Biden, the Build Back Better proposal that he ran as part of his platform. And he enacted recently, one of his 40 executive orders was this Buy American executive order that also aims to bring back to American soil most of the production output of American companies in areas that are where Puerto Rico has a lot of expertise on medical device and pharma and others. So clearly, it would be great if we could come up with a proposal that everyone could support and have a united front here in DC as far as Puerto Rico is concerned. That has proven elusive in the past. Anyway, it's something that we will track and keep you all updated on any developments. But I think on my end, that is the lay of the land.
That's a lot of land you covered. So a lot of great information. Thank you so much, Luis. I might have some time to come back to you with a question that has come in. I want to go over to Lillian now. And Lillian, a lot of what you talked to us last time as a panelist, again, was the SNAP program and the food insecurities by not having SNAP within the Puerto Rico group. So I know a lot has happened in the past 6 months on that front. So what can you talk about, just not just NAP to SNAP, but the food insecurity as a whole? What are some of the things going on in Puerto Rico that we can look forward to seeing?
Well, I do focus on NAP to SNAP and increases in NAP funding for Puerto Rico overall. So that's sort of going to be my focus, Heather, on this, conversation. Obviously, there's huge food insecurity in Puerto Rico. There is a limitation on the amount of food production and agriculture in Puerto Rico, as everyone on this call probably knows. So the circular economy that exists between the U.S. and Puerto Rico is stronger than ever. Puerto Rico is clearly having about 90% of all of the food and beverages coming from the U.S., into the island. So the interdependency and the economic viability for the states that have manufacturing and distribution and processing it's important what happens in Puerto Rico for the U.S. And we're actually the Coalition for Food Security Puerto Rico. Part of our work is going to be a study that is focused on the importance of the food and beverage industry in Puerto Rico, but very specifically also what the economics are between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. When you think about, $200 million in poultry that is purchased from, various states and how that moves into Puerto Rico. But it's not just, meats, it's also the produce, it's dairy, it's flour, it's everything, right? When we're talking food and beverage, we're not even talking about, some of these other, products, personal hygiene and all that also come from the States into Puerto Rico. So it's really important. What I want to focus on for the folks on the phone, and Luis gave a lot of information and top level highlights around what's happening in Washington, D.C. and where we are right now around building food security in Puerto Rico is we have a lot of great opportunity and great intentionality to be able to move Puerto Rico into SNAP and have a stronger food system in Puerto Rico. So let me talk real quick. I have notes. Some of the 2020 results, I think last time I was with you guys, we talked about the 300 million that had come in from the first two COVID-19 packages. That was all used and expended by the Department of Family Services in Puerto Rico through September. Two big things happened after that. One was there was a huge advocacy campaign for Puerto Rico to get pandemic EBT. Puerto Rico in the spring had not been included in pandemic EBT. And what is that? Pandemic EBT provides families with school-age children financial support through NAP so that they could replace those 2 meals and snacks that children would have, throughout the day in Puerto Rico. It's significant. It's 119, averages $119 per child in the public or private school system. In November, Puerto Rico was put into the program, and finally last week, those dollars began to come into the food system in Puerto Rico and to benefit those families and those children. The way the plan was conceptualized was the children would receive the first 5 months as a lump sum. So it's close to like $600 per child. And that all was released last week. And then Puerto Rico has some, there's some questions and complexity around, is there going to be a hybrid around virtual learning, and when will kids go back in? So the reason I highlight that is because it affects what happens in March, April, and May. But as it stands right now, Puerto Rico was able to get the aid retroactive to August. So you have from August till February, this aid that is available to school-age children that are learning in these virtual environments in Puerto Rico. And like I said, it's 120 per child. So it really benefits the families. The other thing that we were able to work on and secure was in the end of December, there had been some huge upticks in SNAP in the States. There was a 15% uptick that was approved and provided to SNAP beginning October 1st. Puerto Rico did not have the benefit of that. So at the end in December and towards the end of December, there was an appropriation made of over $614 million. That also benefits the 2 territories. If any of you are policy wonks and actually look at these bills, it left Puerto Rico with the $597.6 million that still have not been felt by the families and and what I mean by that is the appropriation is not released yet because Puerto Rico must submit a plan and it must be approved by the USDA. And now we have, the Vilsack as secretary, and they'll work on it, and our coalition will be very supportive on how that money moves. But it's close to an additional 600 million, and it's through September 30th of 2021. So that's over the course of the next, 6 to 7 months. And of course, Puerto Rico has flexibility on how it develops the plan. Now, Luis mentioned the American Rescue Plan. That is Biden's big proposal for the $1.9 trillion. Luis, I just heard today, I just saw it. I was checking some things as you were talking to see where we are on the House bill. Supposedly a new version was put out. It increases the aid by 11 billion and it has a lot of infrastructure. Why do we care about that in the food and beverage industries? Because it contains $1 billion in additional nutrition aid for Puerto Rico and the other 2 territories, American Samoa and Northern Mariana Islands. And we already know that when the formulas come out, Puerto Rico benefits from that greatly. It would be an additional 900 million over and above the 597 I've just mentioned, and the Puerto Rico block grant, which started obviously running October 1st with the beginning of the fiscal year, which also had a slight increase and went to $2.03 billion. So as of early this week, that 1 billion was intact in the House bill. It is expected that the House will approve it. And as Luis said, because they're doing this package as part of the budget reconciliation process, you need a simple majority to approve it. So if all 50 Democrats plus the vice president show up and say, yes, we want this, it will be approved. There are some questions, and Luis already talked about it, right? The minimum wage is a big issue. Democrats want $15. I think the GOP has come out with a counter proposal going up to $10. So that's an issue. But for us, the $1 billion in additional nutrition aid for Puerto Rico is still intact. So that's really on the NAP front, and that's the additional appropriations that we've all been working on and supporting as a coalition. In addition to that, we have two major bills. I'm going to start with one that also affects food and beverage, and that is there is a bill that Senator Gillibrand wants to bring forward in April called Closing the Meal Gap, that would change the formula that they use to determine how SNAP is given, basic benefits each month to households. That's why that's important. Remember this, the Thrifty Food Plan is what drives all of the formulas. It's a formula that uses what is the food cost index versus inflation versus other factors, and that's what they use. She wants to either replace the Thrifty Food Plan with the Low Cost Food Plan, which is about a 30% increase in aid, or I'm hearing that Secretary Vilsack believes that he has the authority to raise that the percentage that's used in the formula for Thrifty Food Plan. Whether he'll do it by 30%, probably not. But if he could adjust it by 10 or 15%, that would be significant. But we'll see what happens. So that's one bill. So I'm going to plant that with the people on the phone, because we can use your support if that bill gets introduced, Closing the Meal Gap Act. And that's Senator Gillibrand and certain other, and obviously Senator Harris was when she was Senator Harris, this was also her baby. So we know it's going to get support from the administration. Here's the other big one that, Luis talked a little bit about the Puerto Rico agenda that was put out by the Biden administration. I don't know if I mentioned this to you or Luis has mentioned this to you in the past, but there are certain lawsuits where Puerto Rico has been prevailing in the district court and in the Court of Appeals that is specifically focused on the federal benefits equity for Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has prevailed in the lower courts, district court, Court of Appeals, and one of them actually is at the Supreme Court now, where here is the basis for it. Puerto Rico is citizens who reside in Puerto Rico are being discriminated against on the basis of residency. What does that mean? If I live in Florida, I can have SNAP. I'm a US citizen. If I love Puerto Rico and say, wow, I want to be in a warmer climate, or I'm in Iowa and I want to go to Puerto Rico, or if I'm in Minnesota or Texas and I want to go to Puerto Rico and live there, you lose SSI, you lose SNAP, and you really experience a huge drop in the Medicare and Medicaid aid that is available to you. So what does that mean? There was a group of people in Puerto Rico, they sued. They sued in the district court. They prevailed. Puerto Rico prevailed in the SSI case. It went to the Court of Appeals because, of course, the administration challenged it, the Trump administration. They lost in the Court of Appeals. Puerto Rico prevailed. And now this SSI case is in the Supreme Court. The other case also includes SNAP, SSI, and the health benefits, and has 9 plaintiffs. Puerto Rico has prevailed. This list of plaintiffs in the district court, and now it's in the Court of Appeals. In addition to those lawsuits, our coalition and other advocates are involved in a new bill called the Comprehensive Benefits Equity Act that will move Puerto Rico into SNAP, into SSI, full participation, full inclusion, and will bring Puerto Rico to the right levels on Medicare and Medicaid. There's Part A, Part B, Part D. It's a much more complex scenario when it comes to healthcare. But for SNAP, it would just be put Puerto Rico into SNAP. And the bill also would provide for implementation dollars for the government of Puerto Rico to be able to change, the technology and hire and do whatever they need to do so that the infrastructure of managing those dollars is matches what we have in the States. So those are two very, very important bills that will affect SNAP and also, more importantly, impact Puerto Rico's inclusion into SNAP. And as Luis already mentioned, most of us who are doing this work, I strongly believe, and I started doing this like on November 4th, that the window of opportunity is really, it doesn't mean that it ends, but if we want to move something this important for Puerto Rico, we have to do it before November of 2022, because we have a really strong political will, public will, a lot of work. We have the lawsuits and we have these bills that can actually move us forward. So that's everything I have on the legislative side. And on the funding side, we're very hopeful that when we end up the end of the year, we will have had in excess of $3 billion, $3.2 billion in additional nutrition aid for Puerto Rico. The $1 billion has a lot of flexibility. You know, it says you can spend it up to 6 years, but that's not going to happen. The importance of that $3.3 billion, which actually $3.4 billion number is, that is the number that gives us equity with SNAP if we were part of SNAP at this time. And because of COVID, the numbers every month for every beneficiary in the states has been increasing pretty significantly. And I'll leave you with this number. In Puerto Rico, if Luis and I lived there and we were single family households and we needed NAP, we would get $112 a month. Right now in the States, it's going up to $234 a month. Mm-hmm. It is more than 100% increase. That's why this matters. That's why we're doing this work. And that's why everyone who's on this phone, if you're representing a major company, we could use your support in articulating why Puerto Rico should have full equity into these benefits. So that's what we have. We're in a very strong position and we're in a good place, not only with the appropriations process, but also with, you know, the transition into SNAP.
Yeah, you know, Lillian, I was just going to go back to that last point that you had just made, is the weight that the Democrats are carrying until midterm elections at this point, right, which at that point things could change, is vital for, you know, a lot of these recommendations that you have to get change, to implement a lot of that money and distribute it. We are...
and I just want to mention, it was in the news today for the folks on the phone, 150 CEOs sent a letter, a sign-on letter to Congress today asking them to approve this $1.9 trillion, including the CEO of AT&T, Google, Goldman Sachs, Blackstone. So it's a very, I mean, it is a campaign by the Biden administration to show and get that support from the private business sector, but they're hitting across many sectors. So I wouldn't be